3 weeks ago, I stumbled onto something that genuinely made my blood run cold. I was up at 2 in the morning, half awake, digging through public property records the way you do when something just doesn't feel right. That's when I noticed a pattern so disturbing that I checked it 5 separate times, refreshing pages, reloading data, even writing the numbers down by hand, because I honestly didn't want to believe what I was seeing. What I uncovered explains exactly why your rent keeps climbing while rental properties seem to be vanishing from the market. And the people behind it are betting everything on one thing that you'll never connect the dots. Here's what started this whole investigation. Back in February, my cousin was looking for a flat in Sudok. Nice area. Nothing luxury, nothing flashy, just a standard 2-bedroom. The kind of place normal people actually live in. She found what seemed like the perfect spot, submitted her application, and was waiting to hear back. Then something strange happened. Overnight, the property disappeared. Not marked as rented, not listed as sold, just gone. Wiped from every major listing site. At first, we laughed it off. Maybe the landlord changed their mind. Maybe it went to someone else quietly. But the feeling stuck with me. So I started asking around. A friend of mine at work said his sister had the same thing happen in Hackney. A neighbour mentioned a flat down the street that vanished before anyone even viewed it. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't a one-off. Dozens of properties across London were disappearing in the exact same way. Not being rented, not being sold to first-time buyers, just quietly removed from the market as if they'd never existed. That's when I decided to track it myself. For the past 3 weeks, I've been monitoring property transactions, rental listings, and public records across London. Every borough, every update, every change. And what I found will completely change how you think about the housing crisis in this city. Because the official story you keep hearing sounds comforting. We're told rental yields in London are down about 12% this year. A minor market correction. Normal cycles. Nothing to panic about. But the data tells a very different story. And I'm not talking about leaks, whistleblowers, or anonymous insiders. This is all publicly available information, records anyone can access, if they bother to look at it together instead of in isolation. The real decline in London rental yields since January is 37%. More than triple what's being reported. Tower Hamlets has seen rental property values collapse by 49%. Hackney is down 43%. Even areas everyone assumes are untouchable, places like Kensington and Chelsea, have dropped 31%. Now here's where things stop looking like a normal downturn and start looking deeply abnormal. These crashes aren't happening slowly over months. They're happening in sudden, violent drops. On March 15th, rental properties in Sudok lost 18% of their value in a single day. One day. On April 23rd, Lambeth properties dropped 22% overnight. And on May 7th, Westminster rentals crashed 16% in just 4 hours. If you've ever studied market behaviour, or even just lived through enough economic cycles, you know that's not how organic decline works. Markets don't lose 1/5 of their value between breakfast and lunch unless something extraordinary is happening behind the scenes. These patterns don't look accidental, they don't look emotional, they look coordinated, and that raises the most important question of all: who is selling? And why are they all doing it at the same time, at once? Remember back in February, when City Hall announced that big rent-stabilisation initiative, the one that was supposed to protect tenants from unfair rent hikes? At the time, it sounded reasonable, sensible even. I remember my aunt texting me saying, finally, someone's doing something about rent. Most people felt the same way. But almost no one bothered to read the fine print, because that initiative didn't just cap rent increases. It quietly introduced compliance costs that only large corporate operators could realistically afford. It buried individual landlords under layers of administrative paperwork, forms, reports, renewals, that took hours every single week just to stay compliant. It added licensing fees and inspection standards that, on paper, looked harmless, but in practice made small-scale landlordism financially impossible. A friend of mine, his dad owns 2 rental flats in South London, told me he spent more time dealing with compliance emails than he did at his actual job. Within 3 months he was operating at a loss. And here's the part that should make you angry. I managed to get hold of the economic modelling that the Mayor's office commissioned before these policies were rolled out. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't hindsight. This was their own internal projection. Their economists predicted that between 40% and 60% of small landlords would exit the London market within 6 months of implementation. Read that again. The policy was designed knowing it would force nearly half of London's small landlords out. That wasn't an unintended consequence. That was the plan. So if small landlords are being systematically pushed out, there's an obvious follow-up question. Where do all those properties go? Because tens of thousands of rental homes don't just vanish, they don't evaporate. They end up somewhere, in someone's hands, on someone's balance sheet. And this is where the story gets really interesting. There are 3 institutional property companies that have been absolutely feasting during this so-called housing crisis: London Property Holdings, Metropolitan Residential Group, and Capital City Rentals. Between them, they now control over 40,000 rental properties across London. Now, on its own, institutional investors buying property isn't suspicious. That's their business model. But the timing of these purchases, and the way they line up perfectly with the market crashes, is where everything starts to fall into place. I've spent the past 2 weeks mapping transaction patterns from the land registry, cross-checking dates, volumes, and locations. And once you see it laid out, the pattern is impossible to ignore. On March 15th, the exact same day rental properties in Sudok lost 18% of their value, London Property Holdings purchased 347 properties in a single coordinated wave. That borough. All of them bought within a 4-hour window. Every single purchase reflected the post-crash prices, not the values from the day before. No hesitation, no lag. Then it happened again. On April 23rd, when Lambeth Properties dropped 22% overnight, Metropolitan Residential Group stepped in and acquired 291 properties. Once again, the purchases were clustered within hours of the collapse. And then a third time, on May 7th, as Westminster Rentals lost 16% in just 4 hours, Capital City Rentals bought 412 properties across the borough. Once is coincidence. Twice is suspicious. 3 times is coordination. These companies aren't reacting to crashes, they're positioned for them. They're buying distressed properties at fire sale prices on the exact same day as values implode. But here's the part that genuinely made my jaw drop when I dug into the public records to see who advised the Mayor's office on the rent stabilisation policies. Familiar names started appearing in the meeting minutes. Executives, consultants, representatives from London Property Holdings, Metropolitan Residential Group, and Capital City Rentals. The same companies now hoovering up properties. They helped design the very policies that made small landlord businesses impossible to sustain. Then they used their massive cash reserves to buy properties from landlords who couldn't survive under those regulations. Properties they acquired at steep discounts because the market was crashing right on schedule. A friend of mine, his mum owned a single rental flat she relied on for retirement, was forced to sell after failing 2 inspections she couldn't afford to upgrade for. Guess who bought it? One of these groups through a shell subsidiary? Now, you might be thinking, okay, big companies are buying property. Maybe that's not great. But does it really matter who owns rental homes as long as they're available? That would be a fair question, if this were a normal competitive market, but that's not what's being built here. What's being created is market concentration. A handful of corporations controlling a dominant share of London's rental housing, and with that, the power to set terms, prices, and conditions with almost no meaningful competition. I managed to get my hands on internal strategy documents from all 3 companies, and their long-term plans should worry anyone who rents in London. They're planning dynamic pricing systems that adjust your rent in real time based on demand algorithms. Think surge pricing, but for your home. They're developing behavioral monitoring systems that track tenant activity and adjust rental terms based on your lifestyle patterns when you're home, how you use utilities, how desirable you are as a tenant. They want bundled service packages that force you to buy utilities, internet, and insurance from their own corporate subsidiaries, removing your ability to shop around. But the most alarming part isn't just what they plan to do with the properties they already control. It's what they're planning to do with housing policy itself. Because these companies have drafted legislation that would make individual property ownership in London virtually impossible for ordinary people. We're talking about licensing requirements that cost more than most people earn in an entire year, compliance standards that require commercial-grade property management systems, the kind only large corporations already have in place. Taxation structures, deliberately designed to make small-scale property investment economically unviable from day one. And guess who's planning to introduce this legislation? The same office that created the Rent-Stabilisation Initiative, the policy that triggered this entire chain reaction in the first place. Now here's where their plan started to fall apart. About 3 weeks ago, a massive investment fund called Global Housing Partners made a move nobody was expecting. They decided to dump their entire London property portfolio onto the market. We're talking 12,000 rental properties hitting the market almost at once. This wasn't just another institutional investor walking away. Global Housing Partners was the primary funding source for the 3 companies coordinating those strategic purchases: London Property Holdings, Metropolitan Residential Group, and Capital City Rentals. When Global Housing Partners pulled out, it triggered an immediate liquidity crisis. Overnight, those 3 companies were forced to switch from aggressive buying to desperate selling. The coordinated purchases that had been artificially propping up parts of the market stopped cold. And the moment that support vanished, the market went into absolute freefall. I've seen emergency briefing documents from late October. In just 1 week, London rental property values dropped 15%. Even luxury properties in so-called safe prime locations were losing value day after day. The crisis that was engineered to wipe out small landlords was now threatening to collapse the entire London rental market, and the people who designed it had no idea how to stop it. Here's how you know they were panicking. The monthly rental market reports that City Hall used to publish automatically suddenly delayed for data verification that never seems to finish. The public property transaction databases that anyone could once access now require special permissions. Permissions nobody ever receives. Even more telling, the Mayor's office has instructed London boroughs to stop publishing their own rental market data. Local councils that used to release detailed statistics on property values and rental yields have been told to classify that information as commercially sensitive. A friend of mine who works in a borough planning office said their entire data dashboard was taken offline without explanation. So I've had to piece together the real numbers the hard way, using independent sources, estate agents, property management firms, landlord associations. People who track this data because their livelihoods depend on it. London has lost over 60,000 rental properties in just the past 6 months. Not lost to redevelopment, not converted into offices or demolished. Lost because landlords were pushed to the edge, sold up, and exited the market entirely. My uncle did exactly that. He owned one rental flat for nearly 20 years. After the new compliance rules came in, the numbers simply stopped working. He sold, walked away, and said he'd never touch rental property again. What's left of the rental market is now increasingly controlled by a small number of large corporations. And that leads to exactly what you'd expect. Fewer choices for tenants, higher prices for the remaining properties, and a rental market that's more rigid, more expensive, and less responsive than it's been in decades. But here's the part nobody expected. The cover-up is starting to unravel, because too many people have seen what's really happening. Landlord groups are launching legal challenges against the rent stabilisation policies. Tenant associations are demanding answers about why rental choice has collapsed so suddenly and so dramatically. Even a handful of MPs are finally asking uncomfortable questions about the links between policy changes and market manipulation. But the most effective resistance is coming from somewhere completely unexpected: estate agents and property professionals. The people who see transaction data every single day. The people who know which companies are buying, when they're buying, and how coordinated those purchases really are. They understand that these crashes aren't random, and they're starting to speak out. Over the past few weeks, I've been contacted by more than 40 estate agents, property managers, and industry professionals. People I've never met before. People who have nothing to gain and everything to lose. They're providing transaction records, internal emails, company communications, documents that clearly show coordination between policy decisions and institutional buying. More importantly, they're organising a coordinated information campaign to make sure London voters understand what's been done to their housing market. So here's what actually happened to London's rental market. This wasn't market forces, it wasn't normal economic cycles. It wasn't Brexit uncertainty or inflation or any of the other explanations you've been fed. This was deliberate policy manipulation. designed to transfer property ownership from individuals to corporations. It was coordinated between City Hall and institutional investors. Investors who funded political campaigns and advised directly on housing policy. The rent stabilisation initiative was never primarily about protecting tenants. It was about creating the conditions that would force small landlords out of the market. The institutional investors who helped design these policies then used their massive cash reserves to buy up distressed properties at enormous discounts. They coordinated their purchases to trigger artificial market crashes in specific boroughs, pushing prices down even further before swooping in to acquire properties in bulk. And now, they're preparing the final move. They plan to use their market dominance to push for new legislation that would lock in their position permanently, making it almost impossible for individual landlords or ordinary people to ever compete again. The mayor's team is panicking now, and you can see it in every rush statement and delayed report. The crash has been too severe and too visible. What was meant to be a slow, controlled transition has turned into a catastrophic collapse that can't be hidden or explained away. But the damage is already done. London has lost a huge portion of its rental housing stock. What remains is increasingly controlled by large corporations with monopoly power and deep political influence, and the consequences for ordinary Londoners are no longer theoretical. They're already here. Higher rents, fewer choices, corporate landlords with no real accountability to local communities. A close friend of mine has been trying to move closer to work for 6 months. Every time a reasonable listing appears, it's gone within hours, or it reappears weeks later with a higher price and stricter terms. This isn't coincidence. It's the system working exactly as designed. London's next election is coming, and voters deserve to know the truth about how this crisis was created. They deserve to understand the connections between housing policies and the companies that profited from them. If you've been affected by London's housing crisis, if you've watched rental options disappear or seen prices spiral beyond reach, if you've ever wondered why the market feels stacked against ordinary people rather than working for them, now you know why. Share this with everyone you know who's trying to find housing in London. The more people who understand what really happened, the harder it becomes for those responsible to dodge accountability. Subscribe for updates as this crisis continues to unfold, and for what we can do next to demand honest, transparent housing policy. Because if we don't expose the truth about what happened to London's rental market, this exact same playbook will be rolled out in cities across the entire country and beyond.